When we think of contentment, we usually describe it in terms of how things are doing in our life. When all is well, then we are content. When the bills are paid, when you and your family are healthy, when the internet connection is fast, when you can still afford a fast food meal, then we can say of ourselves that we have contentment. Contentment for many people has a lot to do with the positive things that are currently happening in their life, like a growing relationship, plans that are coming together, financial security, business growth, religious freedom, and career advancement. When it comes to discontentment or discontent, we also speak about it in terms of the negative things that are going on in our life, like job loss, failures, disappointments, financial challenges, sickness, and misfortunes. It seems that our common sense understanding of contentment is almost always connected to the external circumstances of life. So when life is generally well, we think of contentment as worth our consideration. But when circumstances of life are obviously bad, we feel that we are justified in believing that we can be discontented at that point in our life. Now, consider this. If we think that contentment would have to be necessarily associated with whatever is going on in our life, then it would be quite impossible for anyone to find contentment in life. Our situation in life changes constantly, shifting at random from bad to good, from good to bad. If contentment is to be grounded on the externals, then contentment would have to fluctuate with the changing tides and winds of life. So you could feel contented one day because all is well and good, but be totally discontented the following day because a calamity struck overnight. But somehow, people are still convinced that if they can only have the better things, the bigger things, and the greater things in life, then they might experience contentment in this life. This is probably one of the factors that drives our use of our resources. We seek the finer things in life, hoping that in enjoying the most affluent, luxurious, and pleasurable things in life, we will find contentment. We are probably thinking that when we have tried it all, seen it all, tasted it all, and experienced it all, then our desires will be staved off, and then we would learn contentment. But just like a survivor at sea who has gone without fresh water for a couple of days will be so tempted to drink seawater, thinking that seawater would quench his or her thirst. But we all know that if he or she drinks seawater, he or she will get more dehydrated than not drinking anything at all. Now, many people have drunk this water, the seawater of materialism, money, power, worldly pleasure, success, and popularity. And now they still find themselves hungry and thirsty and satisfied and discontented. Now I know we all struggle with finding contentment. We become discontented maybe because we cannot help it, but compare ourselves with others, which in turn make us think that we should also be getting the things that they have. Or perhaps you're just curious of the things that you never had, and you're seeking new and unfamiliar experiences, perhaps. It could be that you're always striving for a better future, as you have been taught. For some, contentment has become elusive because they are always wanting to please other people. They're always wanting to improve people's perception of them. I mean, in other words, in other people, it's their social upbringing that has conditioned them to never say enough, to acquire more things, to be better off, to accumulate, or to accomplish, or to achieve more. Now, whatever is fueling your sense of discontent today, I would like to help you understand that it is God's will. It is God's will for you to experience contentment in this life. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, testified how he has learned to be content in whatever circumstance that he was in, whether good or bad. At the closing of this letter, Paul would spell out for us the true nature of Christian contentment and explain how he himself has experienced this kind of contentment in his own life. Now, as for you and me, we shall see that contentment is essentially about dependence. At the heart of the contentment problem is a trust issue. Paul is going to argue that contentment cannot come out of one's external circumstances. It is an internal state of the heart that proceeds from one's trust and confidence in God. It is not a state that one can achieve or arrive at, but it is what God brings in the hearts of those who look to Him only for their sustenance and well-being, and to those who realize that God is the only all-sufficient source of joy and fulfillment in this life. So here's a simple principle that we can derive from Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 to 13. When we are fully dependent on God in all things, we can be truly content in everything. To be content in everything is to be dependent on God in all things. Or to say, God creates contentment in the heart of a person who is dependent on Him, and that dependence on God in all things brings contentment in everything. Now, let me read to you what Paul has to say about contentment in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 to 13. Verse 10, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether in plenty or in want. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. As you read through the letter of the Philippians, you would notice that Paul would repeatedly express his gratitude for the continued support that he is receiving from the Philippian believers. And it would sound like this letter is one overextended thank you letter. In this letter, he would mention his heartfelt thanks for the unfailing, unwavering support of these Christians from Philippi. They were the first one to send out a financial support to Paul, and they kept doing it throughout his missionary journey. But as you read through the letter also, you would notice that it seems that their latest support for Paul took longer than it usually did. It did not arrive on time. I don't know what the delay was, what the reason for the delay was. It must have been that they were not able to gather enough funds, or probably some logistical issues. So it took a while. Perhaps it caused some kind of some hardship on the part of Paul, because he was probably operating on very, very low budget. We don't know that, but that seems to be implied in many instances in the letter. But what matters to Paul now, when he wrote this letter, is that the financial support has arrived. It's here now, and he's very happy about it. I mean, when he received this letter through the guy, or through the man named Epaphroditus in the same chapter, I mean, he immediately responded by sending out this letter to the Philippians. What we are looking at today is only the last chapter and a few verses of that last chapter for this letter. This is a section where Paul is explicitly commending and thanking the Philippians for all that they have done to support his apostolic ministry. So beginning in verse 10, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. He's very happy that the gift has arrived. I mean, this was an affirmation of their continued commitment to support his ministry. Now, you have to understand that back in those days, they didn't have many remittance or payment channels or something similar. If you are to send a gift to a traveling missionary like Paul, you would have to send an individual who would hand carry the money and travel and find Paul wherever he is to catch up with Paul, meet up with him, and personally hand over the money to Paul. Now, depending on where Paul is or how far he is from the city of Philippi, it would take days, perhaps even weeks of traveling on foot, on horseback, or perhaps by boat as well. But it would take some time for the aid to arrive, where Paul is at. Now, of course, depending on what his financial situation is already at that point, we don't know if he has enough to eat or if his finances are really, really critical. At times he would have to trust that God would work in the hearts of people that he has ministered to, and that through them, gifts and help would arrive to support his ministry. But it has arrived already at this point, and he's just ecstatic about it. He has waited for this gift for a long time, and is just completely overjoyed by the fact that they send Epaphroditus, and Epaphroditus brought some gifts for him, and he would hear news about how things are going in the city of Philippi. But Paul is, he's got God's wisdom in him, and he is aware that this sense of joy and gratitude that he is expressing to them might easily be misunderstood. So he wanted to clarify immediately what he means by saying that I am happy for all that they are doing for him and on his behalf. He clarified in context how he is viewing the support that he is receiving from them. What he is saying is that he is not demanding for another gift in the future, and he is insisting that the Philippians are under no obligation to keep on supporting him. That's why he writes, I am not saying this because I am in need, or I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Now, probably one way to understand this is to think of a time when you gave someone a gift. It could be a child, one of your children, a relative, a friend, or a special someone. And upon receiving the gift, the person would voice out his or her thanks in such a way that it would be hard for you not to conclude that that person is hoping for another gift. Have you had that experience? Where they're saying, oh, thank you very much, and I hope you would still remember me on Christmas Day. Right? The hints are obviously pointing to an expectation of a future gift. And Paul says, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to guilt trip you. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, that next time please send the gifts quicker. Just do bank transfer. It's very difficult to wait for your messenger. Can you just send it through GCash? Or I could get it instantly. That's not what Paul is saying. He's saying, don't even think about it. I really appreciate what you guys are doing for me, and I'm happy about it. But he strongly denies that his motivation is in order for him to receive further assistance from these people. Instead, he would impress upon the Philippians his perspective on their gifts. So he says, please, I love what you're doing, but don't ever think that I would have to depend on you for my well-being and survival. I appreciate what God is doing through you. I want you to excel in this grace of giving. But don't ever think or get the false impression that I have become needy now, or that somehow I am indebted to you because of what you are doing for me. I am thankful, but I'm not fully depending on what you are giving me. That's why he says, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstance says. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have in plenty. That's just another way of saying, I know how to survive even if your gifts don't arrive anymore. If I don't get that credit on my bank account, I can still manage to continue the work that God has called me to do. Or even if, I get different gifts from many different churches and I have enough, I can still continue with what I am doing because I have learned to be content in plenty and in want. The verb learn is the same verb where we get the word for student or a pupil. Generally, it means to learn something as we understand it in the English language. But this particular usage here points more to the idea of realizing something. So it's the realization that he can be contented. He realizes not from reading something or from browsing through the internet and picking up an insight from one of the more famous motivational speaker. That's now he arrived at that contentment that he's talking about. But he arrived at the contentment state, or contented state, I should say, through experience and practice. Because he knew what it's like to live on something little or almost nothing. So he has managed to be in both extremes. And he said, this has become my laboratories, if you may. In the poverty, aspect of my practicum, where things are really bad and things are really difficult, I have to manage with whatever little resources I have learned to be content. But when things are well and there is an abundance and everything is provided for, and I'm not thinking of where the next money is going to come from, I'm also fine with that. I have managed to live well in that particular scenario. You see, when you have plenty, it's very easy to be arrogant and to be self-sufficient. But when you are poor, it's very easy to feel needy and entitled. But to keep your head above the water in both situations, you need to learn contentment. So Paul is declaring here that contentment is utterly independent of his circumstances in life. He can carry on the ministry with an empty stomach. He can hold his head high and preach the gospel to people even when he hasn't eaten in the last 3 days. Even if he has an empty pocket, he does not look at that and get discouraged and not continue with the ministry. But he understands that when there's food in the table, when the pocket is empty, it doesn't matter to him. He continues on with what God has called him to do. So his sense of contentment does not arise out of his personal resources and means, but comes from the one who strengthens him, as he would declare in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. So what he would say then is that after I have learned contentment, or the reason why I've learned contentment is because there is this enabling power that capacitates me to do what I do, even in the most extreme of all circumstances. So he says in verse 13, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Now, I understand that many people love this passage, and we know of boxers who had it tattooed on their skin, and some people consider this to be their life verse. But it would be better, as it is always, to understand this verse in context. And you would agree with me that the immediate context is really about contentment. That is why when it says, I can do all this is probably looking back. This is not a reference to to everything in life, as it is sometimes interpreted. I can do all this, that is in the sense that I can do anything. That somehow, because of Christ working in me, I can be a super Christian. Even if I don't have any singing abilities, I can stand up, on Sunday and sing because I can do all things, right? Even if I haven't studied for the exam, I can do all things and sit there and claim this particular promise. That may not be the case, because the context is quite clear to us that this is about Paul continuing on with the ministry that God has given him, even in the most extreme of all circumstances. He has learned to be content. So he says, it is God who gives him that strength. So more often we hear of this passage being taken out of context. Now maybe as a secondary application, you can say that this is a promise that God would enable us to do the things that He has called us to do. That's probably a fair application of this. But to use this as a blanket statement, and to prod your child, to take the exam because you can do all things in Christ, may a little bit, I think it's a little bit overboard. Won't you agree? Because this is specifically talking about how Paul is responding to the changing circumstances in his life. So everything here is not necessarily unlimited. Could be directly talking about, the extremes that he said, in plenty and in want, in hunger and in being satisfied. It doesn't mean that, you can do all things through Christ and you can walk on water and raise the dead, because you can do maybe in some miraculous way, but not probably on an everyday basis. It doesn't mean that, as I have mentioned, that because you can do all things through Christ, that even though you're not skilled or trained for that particular task, that you can somehow manage and do it well. That's probably not a good application of this passage. But all things in this context has something to do with every circumstance, the one that Paul referred to as in plenty and in want. So when it says, I am able to do, I have the power, or I have become competent to live under such circumstances in my life. And then he says, because there is this one person who empowers me. That's a crucial line, because it's pointing to us the fact that this sense of contentment is not something that is humanly derived. The ability and even the capacity to learn or to arrive at the state of being content is something that God Himself does in the life of a person. Paul says it's God who strengthens me. Nothing else. I did not will myself into a state of contentment. I did not empty my mind so that nothing but peace and contentment, took over my thoughts. I can be content because God enables me, and that's another way of saying because I am dependent on the enablement that Jesus brings into my life. But maybe the first step towards, learning what contentment is like is to really simply thank God. Just developing that sense of gratitude. Just thanking God for the things that you don't even mind enjoying on a regular basis. Thank God that you still have a job. Thank God that you're still receiving a regular income. Thank God that none of your family members have contracted COVID. Thank God that you don't have to deal with hospital bills. Not only for the things that didn't happen, thank God that you are still able to worship today. Thank God that you have friends that you can contact, from faraway places using technology. There's a lot that we can be thankful for. But more than that, what follows after gratitude is learning to enjoy the things that you already have. Or if you don't like how life is, turning for you, or you don't like how life is going for you, then what you probably need to do is to like life as it is. Because contentment, after all, is about depending wholly on God. And when you are fully dependent on God in all things, then you can truly be content in everything.